So we're here to solve this statue park puzzle by Prasanna Seshadri. While it's a Monday puzzle, it's a pretty challenging puzzle, at least to get the first logical step. With so few shapes to put into the grid, once you get a little bit of a start, it will just all land on the paper in principle. But the starting point is tricky, and for those who are trying to do this fully by logic, there are a few kinds of things that statue park puzzles in general require. And so I'll give you some sense of the key constraints that give you a break into the puzzle, and then through those constraints, how you can get to the logical solution. Two kinds of constraints are first, where are some of the clues limited to just really one or a few kinds of shapes? And I'll give you some examples here. Actually, one of the first cells you can mark off of the grid is that this cell is not part of a tetromino. And the reason is if it were, one of these cells at least is going to be white, and it's not going to be able to connect to the rest of the grid. And so when you mark that this cell is off, you'll start to see that a shape like this doesn't have so many places to grow. If it takes this cell, it always takes the one above, which forms an L. And if it doesn't take that cell, it comes down, and it can't get two more cells without taking this cell, and so it forms an I. And so at the start of the grid, having marked this cell in, you may be able to see that this clue is always going to be an I shape or an L shape. And that's a starting point. It's not going to get you going because those two shapes actually don't share any cells in common. Nothing more you can mark here. But let's keep looking around the grid, and let's keep looking at these cells that are the more constrained black circles on the left side. This black circle here can form an L like this, and it can form an L like this, and its last shape is this I. And so it also is a shape that has a constraint of I and L. And this may be enough for you to see that there's already a forced logical deduction from it. The reason to think that is if one of these is an L, it's not the same as the other L, and there would be two L's in the grid. So for sure, this one has to be an I, and when you put in that it's an I, they end up connecting and they're both I's. But there's another cell that can help you in the same way, and that's this top one. And that's because this top cell is also just as limited in the shapes it can form. It can't form a T because it would touch these shapes. It can't form an S. It can't form an O. The only shapes it can form are an I and an L. And like this is an example of an I, or I guess this is an example of an I. This is an example of an L, and this is an example of an L. The only shapes this can form up top are an IL. And so at some stage, seeing that these are constraints, you'll recognize that the first part of the puzzle is not to make this top one be an I, because then you need two L's, and this top part has to be an L shape. And seeing that that's an L shape, this has to be an I shape. Put the I shape in the grid. You get this pattern out. This L comes across here. If it doesn't use this cell, it would form here and form this. That's no good. We don't want to put a second I in the grid, so we'll always take this cell to make this be the L that goes in the grid. Now we can run into what was a different constraint at the start of the puzzle, and a different thing to think through in Statue Park is where one of these shapes can only go in one or a couple places in the whole grid. And the key shape to look at is the O tetromino. And I'll come back to the start and show you that there are no places, if I look at all these vertices, it would have to get all the cells shaded around them. None of these in the top row can be that shape. This is one space where the O can go. And as you keep going down, even like an open place like this, because of the cell next to it, is no good. This is the other place the O can go. And so there are actually only two spots in the start of this grid where the O tetromino could have started. And that gives you an ability to even just focus on the O shape and get some stuff started. Where we've already placed this L in the grid, we actually now know for sure that the O goes in the remaining spots. That gets us to this pattern. We now have two tetrominos left to place, and those are the L and the S and the T. And thinking about those shapes, one thing to see for sure is that while there's going to be a tetromino down in the bottom, even if this cell isn't used, this cell is always part of a tetromino, so it'll help us to just start marking where the two tetrominos are, and these will not be the same shape. And now let's say, where can we put in a T? If this is a T, it has to be this shape, but it puts a T right above. So that's not a good T. The only other T in the grid is this one, so that must be where the T goes. And then we have to place an S for the last tetromino shape, and it comes down here. And so all of these steps had a little bit of look ahead. That's why we gave this a 2-star rating even for a Monday puzzle. It wasn't just simple placement steps, but it did highlight what I think are some key things, even in a small example grid, to learn about this puzzle, where some of the black circles are fairly constrained in what shapes they can be, or where certain shapes like the O are constrained in where they can go in the whole grid. And finding those are the two main routes to making progress when stuck in a statue park. Hopefully that was useful for you to think through how to get through this grid, and certainly for later statue parks this week. We'll see you again soon.